This is a mistake because it demonstrates that the left isn't really providing an alternative to the right. It merely has a different set of priorities by how it would use the resources raised by the inflation machine. It's true that public schools are less costly in terms of lives and property than war, but the inflation-funded welfare state also has a corrosive effect on society. The pipe dream that the inflation monster can be used to promote good instead of evil illustrates a certain naivete about the nature of the state itself. If the state has the power and is asked to choose between doing good and waging war, which will it choose? Certainly in the American context, the choice has always been for war. It is equally naive of the right to talk about restraining the government while wishing for wars around the world. So long as the state has unlimited access to the printing press, it can ignore the pleas of ideological groups concerning how the money will be raised. It is also very silly for the right to believe that it can have its wars, its militarism, its nationalism, its belligerence without depending on the power of the Federal Reserve. This institution is the very mechanism by which the dreams of both fanatical left and fanatical right can become true. The effect of the money machine goes well beyond funding undesirable government programs. The Fed creates financial bubbles that lead to economic dislocation. Think of the technology bubble of the late 1990s, or the housing bubble, or the boom that preceded the current bust. These are all the results of the monopolization of money. These days, the American consumer has been hit very hard with rising prices in oil, clothing, food, and much else. For the first time in decades, people are feeling this and feeling it hard. And just as in every other inflation in world history, people are looking for the culprit and finding the wrong ones. They believe it is the oil companies who are gouging us, or that foreign oil producers are restricting supply, or that gas station owners are abusing a crisis to profit at our expense. I wouldn't entirely rule out the possibility that price controls are around the corner. When Nixon imposed them in 1971 during his part of the war in Vietnam, neither he nor his advisors believed they would actually result in controlling inflation. Rather, the purpose was to redirect the target of public anger from the government and its central bank over to retailers to make them the scapegoats. In this sense, in the Higgsian sense, price controls do work. They make people believe that the government is trying to lower prices while the private sector is trying to raise them. This is the real political dynamic at work with price controls. The question is whether we will be taken in by these tactics. It is long past time for us to take note that the cause of the real trouble here is not the manufacturers or even the war as such, but the agency that has been granted a legal right to counterfeit at will and lower the value of the currency while fueling every manner of statist scheme, whether welfare or warfare. We need to look at the Fed and say, this is the enemy. Note that the Federal Reserve is not a political party. It is not a recognized interest group. It is not a famed lobby in Washington. It is not really even a sector of public opinion. It seems completely shielded off from vigorous public debate. If we truly believe in liberty and decry the Leviathan state, the situation cannot be tolerated. I say to the sincere right, if you really want to limit the state, you will have to give up your dream of remaking the world at the point of a gun. Wars and limited government are impossible. Moreover, you must stop ignoring the role of monetary policy. It is a technical subject, to be sure, but one that we must all look into and understand if we expect to restore something that resembles the American liberty of the founders. I say to the sincere left, if you really want to stop war and stop the spying state and put an end to the persecution of political dissidents and the Guantanamo camps for foreign peoples, and put a stop to the culture of nationalism and militarism, you must join us in turning attention to the role of monetary policy. The printing presses must be unplugged. It's true, this will also hit programs that are beloved by the left, such as socialized healthcare, federalized education programs. But so long as you expect the state to fund your dreams, you cannot expect that the state will not also fund the dreams of people you hate. Let me say a few words to libertarians who dream of a world with limited government under the rule of law, a world in which free enterprise reigns, and where the state has no power to interfere in our lives so long as we behave peacefully. It is completely absurd to believe that this can be achieved without fundamental monetary reform. And yet before the most recent Ron Paul campaign, and aside from Murray Rothbard and his admirers, I don't recall that libertarians themselves have cared much about this issue at all. In 1982, just after our founding, the Mises Institute held a large academic conference on the gold standard, and we held it in Washington, D.C. Even back then, I recall that D.C. libertarians ridiculed us for holding such a meeting to talk about the Fed and its replacement with sound money. They said this would make the Mises Institute look ridiculous, that we would be tarred with a brush of gold bugs and crazies. We did it anyway. And all these years later, the book that came out of that conference remains a main source for understanding the role of money in the advance of despotism, as well as giving us a blueprint for the future. Of course, the Austrian tradition fought paper money and central banking from the beginning. Karl Menger was an advocate of the gold standard. Ludwig von Mises actually established the gold standard as finance minister of the Habsburg monarchy. Mises' book on the topic from 1912 was the first to show the role of money in the business cycle, and he issued dire warnings about central banking. F.A. Hayek wrote powerfully against the abandonment of gold in the 1930s. Henry Hazlitt warned that the Bretton Woods system and the phony gold standard it established would result in exactly the conditions we're in. Murray Rothbard, of course, was a champion of sound money and the greatest enemy the Fed has ever had. But generally, I've long detected a tendency in libertarian circles to ignore this issue, in part for precisely the reasons cited above. It is not respectable. I'll leave aside the fact that, of course, some of the big business interests that finance libertarians benefit from the Fed as well. DC libertarians, not those outside the Beltway like Bumper, needless to say. Well, I will tell you why this issue is not considered respectable. It is the most important priority of the state to keep its money machine hidden behind a curtain. Anyone who dares to pull back that curtain is accused of every manner of intellectual crime. This is precisely the reason we must talk about it on every occasion. We must end the conspiracy of silence on this issue. I was intrigued at how Ron Paul, during his campaign, would constantly bring up the subject. Most politicians are out to play up to their audience, so they say things that people want to hear. I promise you that early in the campaign, no one wanted to hear him talk about the Federal Reserve. But he did it anyway. He worked to educate his audiences about the need for monetary reform, and it worked. For the first time in my life, there is a large and very public movement in this country to take this topic seriously. Just the other day, monetary economist Joseph Salerno was called by C-SPAN, which wanted to interview him on television about the need to restore gold as the basis of the dollar. As I watched this excellent interview, I was struck by what a great triumph it is for liberty that this topic is again becoming part of the national debate. In the 19th century, this was a topic on everybody's minds. It can be again today, provided we do not eschew the truth in the formation of our message. It might be said that advocating privatization is politically unrealistic.